ladies. So now that I'm able to record, tonight we have a special treat for you. We have Dr. Jenny Ritchotte, who is an associate professor of gifted education and director of the Center for Gifted and Talented Education at the University of Northern Colorado. And we also have Dr. Amy Graefe, who's an assistant professor of gifted education and the director of the Summer Enrichment Program at the University of Northern Colorado. And they are going to be sharing their presentation with us tonight, Nurturing the Social Emotional Development of the Whole Gifted Child. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if you can help me welcome Amy and Jenny tonight. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, everyone.
So we are going to dive right in and get started. So just as was announced, we're going to be talking to you about nurturing the social emotional development of the whole gifted child. I am Jenny. This is my 8th year as a professor at UNC in gifted education. I was a teacher before that. I was an English teacher. I have 2 amazing gifted children who are now in 8th grade and 10th grade. So seeing it from the parent end is always really important, I think, having multiple lenses. And I will let Amy tell you a little bit about herself.
I'm Amy Graefe. This is my 4th year at UNC as an assistant professor in the gifted education department. Similar background to Jenny's. I also was a teacher in public schools for 20-some years, 22 years maybe, at elementary, middle, and high school, taught content level classes as well as coordinated gifted programming at the different levels. And I also have 2 daughters who are identified gifted. Mine are a little older. Mine are 23 and 24 now. But we have lots of connections to our kids. We're trying to decide how much you really want to hear about them tonight. So.
Okay, so we only have 25 minutes to share with you about this topic. We actually teach an entire course on the social emotional needs of gifted learners at UNC, but we think we were able to pull out just some really nice information that we love sharing with teachers and parents and staff. So this presentation will primarily address overexcitabilities, kind of funny word that some of you may be familiar with, as they relate to the whole gifted child.
Okay, so we want to start just by giving you a chance to look at some of these descriptors and think about you, your children, your grandchildren, students in your class. Do any of these look familiar? Highly motivated, high standards for oneself, strong sense of justice. So just take a look at that and make some connections in your own mind about who you know that might demonstrate some of these characteristics. It's important to remember as you look at these that these behaviors, and these are behaviors that we're looking at, these can be perceived either positively or negatively, depending upon who is viewing the behavior and where it takes place, the context. So those are very important things to remember as we look at any type of characteristic. So the characteristics on the previous page are considered characteristics of gifted individuals. As you probably noticed, they're somewhat broad, pretty broad descriptors, and it's important to remember anytime that we look at characteristics that they don't necessarily apply to everyone. All of the characteristics are not going to apply to everyone all the time. The term gifted and talented or gifted represents a really wide variety of individuals in our society. And for every characteristic that you see or that you saw on that chart, it is going to apply to some individuals who are gifted and it won't apply to others that are gifted. So some will display the behavior, some gifted individuals won't. So as with all characteristic lists, we always just like to put out that caution that it's a good guide to look at. It kind of helps us focus on things that are typically true, but they're not necessarily true. They're not true across the board. And so that's going to kind of catapult us into some of the descriptors and things that we're sharing tonight. Another big discussion in gifted education is, I don't know that it's a debate necessarily, but there's ongoing deliberation, especially when we're in the schools and we're trying to figure out how to program for gifted learners. Are we talking about who they are? Are they are gifted individuals, or are we concerned about what they do? They are gifted because they have achieved at this level. They are gifted because they have scored this particular score on a cognitive test. You'll probably hear talking to us tonight. We are very focused on who they are as individuals, as opposed to necessarily what they do. We believe that we need to program for that. We need to provide supports at home and at school, but we're concerned about the whole child when we're talking about gifted children.
And Amy, I will also add to that, very much concerned about who they are, but just want to add that, Renzulli talks about, he's a famous researcher in gifted education, talks about gifted behaviors as opposed to giftedness. And the fact that sometimes we may not always see gifted behavior, or what we traditionally would view as gifted behavior, from these kids all the time in every class and every facet of their life. And so sometimes it's the constellation of different things, that allow kids to show you in a way that you understand giftedness, that they are gifted, that they're really excited about something, passionate about something, knowledgeable about something, but that's not always necessarily going to be the case 24/7.
I mentioned whole gifted child on the previous slide, but let's dig a little deeper into what we're talking about when we say whole gifted child. We have two examples from pioneers in the field of gifted education. The text on my left, I'm assuming it's your left, I'm not sure what you're seeing. A child is a total entity, and we think that's so very important. Combination of many characteristics, and that emotions are very much a part of who they are. You can't separate the emotion out from the intellect or from the physical. They're all intertwined, and one influences the other. A gifted 5-year-old does not function or think like an average 10-year-old, nor does this child feel like an average 4 or 5-year-old. These children's thoughts and emotions differ, and as a result, they perceive and react to their world differently. This was Anne-Marie Roper, and we're going to talk more about the perception and reactions that many gifted children display and experience. On the other side of the screen is a visual. George Betts, another pioneer in the field of gifted education, he passed away this past year. Robin Carey and Blanche Capuchin also worked with him on developing this model that looks at the whole gifted child and helping them develop into autonomous learners. It incorporates emotional, social, physical, and then the intellectual and cognitive aspects when we talk about the whole gifted child.
I will just add to that. I think what Amy just said on the slide is so incredibly important. I remember, when I was a classroom teacher, sometimes, you just want to, teach your lesson. You just want to teach, the content that you have to teach. And you don't know, what a child is showing up with, if they're ready to learn, if they have, some social things that are going on, if, there's some distress at home, outside of home. And it's almost impossible to just, focus on cognition, with children. I mean, we do so much more than that as educators. And I think George's model really honors that.
So overexcited abilities were mentioned earlier. Sometimes they're referred to as OEs. These are superstimulant abilities, another term that is used to describe what we're talking about tonight. Dabrowski, who developed this concept and shared it, and it's grown, and other people have taken it on and continued to talk about it and discuss it and develop it and do some research with it. He believed that people with greater developmental potential had a higher level of reactivity in the central nervous system. It wasn't that other individuals didn't experience this type of reactivity, but for gifted individuals, it was so intense, so extreme, that it really impacted who they were and how they saw and processed the world. In the term overexcitabilities, the prefix over is talking about the reactions of excitation, so above. So they're excited, they're reacting above what would typically be considered normal, if there is such a thing as normal, but what would typically be considered normal in intensity, duration, and frequency for individuals who are not gifted.
And I know I keep adding to your slides. But you go first.
Something really interesting about this is that this is evident even in infants. You will be able to start seeing some of these overexcitabilities, and I'm sure as parents, as we go through some of this, you will recognize some things that you figured out about your children at a very, very early age.
I will just add the caveat that the gifted label in and of itself does not mean that a child's going to be predisposed to greater developmental potential. And Dabrowski, he was not familiar with the term gifted, when he was developing this theory. So how we've constructed this idea of giftedness now may not always perfectly align with how Dabrowski had theorized this.
His overexcitabilities fell into 5 different categories. There was intellectual, emotional, sensual, imaginational, and psychomotor. So we're going to look at each of those and some of the characteristics, challenges, and strategies for working with children with overexcitabilities.
So within Dabrowski actually has a separate theory that we just do not have time for in this session, but if you're interested in it, it's called the theory of positive disintegration. And within that theory, essentially, this is just a very simplistic overview, he argues that people have to kind of break down before they can, build themselves up into who they were meant to be. And there's these different levels of kind of struggle to get to the last level, like in his theory, where you're like a completely altruistic person at peace with yourself. He would say that intellectual overexcitability and the next one that we're going to talk about, emotional overexcitability, are 2 of the key factors that tend to predict those higher levels of developmental potential. So with intellectual overexcitability, we often think of this when we think of gifted kids. We think about them thinking, their wheels are turning, they're processing constantly. They have, the desire to ask those complex questions and also to seek out answers. And again, it might not be for everything, for every content area. They might have, a very strong interest in something, 1 year and then, or 1 month, and then it kind of vacillates and changes. So characteristics, and this is not an exhaustive list, but deep curiosity, the love of knowledge and learning, again, not necessarily school content area knowledge and learning, the love of problem solving, may or may not, be involved in avid reading, probably definitely some type of analytical or reflective thinking, going on, possibly the need, for precision, and we'll talk about perfectionism briefly, and the ability for what Csikszentmihalyi would call flow, right? Where you have like this deep concentration, like, in a moment, and there's nothing else kind of around you. You're just fixated on what you're studying, on what you're learning. There are some challenges with this. So when we think about having kind of these busy brains that kind of never shut off, that can lead to perseveration, perseveration on things going on in the world, potentially something we heard or read, something, we saw on TV, something somebody said to us that we just can't let go. Difficulty falling asleep. I know we were going to say we're limited in how much we're going to talk about our children. But yeah, for sure. I mean, that happened. I'm sure Amy would say the same for, her daughters. I would say the same for my children, where, the wheels are just turning and, you just can't shut your brain off. And that might even be true for, you as adults, who are watching this. This is not just something to do with children. So frustration when unable to produce in reality what they see in their minds. This is where we talk about asynchronous development, where your mental age is much greater than your chronological age. So what you're able to actually produce, based on fine motor skills, it might not actually be what you can see and what you can envision in your head. And that might lead to tremendous frustration. Unhealthy perfectionism. Some would argue that there's no such thing as healthy perfectionism. I know Linda Silverman did a conversation. She would definitely say that there's healthy and unhealthy perfectionism. But, where we just kind of fixate, sometimes it might be difficult, to even get us to start. We might procrastinate starting things because it's not going to be what we envisioned, and we might fear failure. Impatience with peers, unable to process at the same intellectual pace, and that may show itself in school and may look like really negative kind of disruptive behavior, and it may just be that student needs a little bit more support in practicing patience and collaborating with peers. So enmeshed in our own thoughts, they may again interrupt others, and they may be punished for this instead of shown, okay, well, this is the appropriate response to have. Overly concerned with adult issues, and sometimes we have to make the tough choices as parents, as educators. What is appropriate? What level of discourse should we have about some of these issues that our children, our students raise? And then existential concerns, which again is not, we don't really have time to discuss this, but that, when these kids are their mental age is much higher than their chronological age, they may, wonder, why am I here? More kind of spiritual, what am I supposed to, be doing? What's the meaning of my life? And that's really heavy stuff, for an elementary school age kid, teenager to be struggling with. Those are some really heavy things. Amy, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I have lots of thoughts, but I know we need to keep moving here. So
yeah, so these are just some basic strategies we're going to give you. So sometimes as adults, we want to provide, the answers. That we want to alleviate any kind of tension or stress and just give them the answers. But we need to empower, our students, our children, by helping them to find their own answers to the questions that they're really interested in. I will say, we have different security things on our computers with what our children are able to access and look at on the internet. The same, with their phones, because sometimes when they're seeking out the answers to their questions, they may get into places that you don't want them to get. So just, be mindful of that, but definitely do help them to know how to find the answers to the questions that they want to know answers to. Provide ways for them to feel like they have some control or impact over their world. I remember, I had a student who was very concerned about just how the animals were, being treated in a local animal shelter, and wanted to do something, and called, the shelter and found out, that they needed different things like blankets and stuff, and did a big collection, and had huge blankets and was cutting them up to make sure that they were the dimensions of the different crates and stuff. But that, instead of kind of perseverating about that issue and letting it bother her, that was a way to kind of have some control over it, or feel like she was actively, engaging in helping, empathize, but help them understand how certain comments might make other people feel. So this is going back to if they are just kind of interrupting and no, this is what it should be. And I will say, even as an adult, I've struggled with this, and it's kind of, we kind of maybe need a strategy. We need to maybe write down, what our thought is, what we want to interject, role play that. These are important skills to teach kids. And I know even at home, we practice that just in daily, conversation with one another. Like, stop and listen. Did you hear, what your brother said before, you wanted to kind of pounce in with like your opinion. So I think having that alignment between home and school is really important. And then, helping them to find mental age peers, which may not always be at school. It may be in other settings where they have people that they feel think like them and can kind of validate their, their thinking, and they don't feel so isolated. Anything with that, Amy?
No, you're doing great.
Yay. Okay, and model love of learning. So right now, this is a little bit trickier, but there are so many wonderful online learning experiences that kids can enjoy, to be able to just learn without the pressure of grades, without the pressure of, some other things that come with some of the activities that they tend to be involved with in and out of school. So these experiences should always be about joy. If it's doing some kind of online like coding program or something, it's their learning, they choose it, and not about pressure. I added this one just because I love reading with my children. It's my daughter, not so much anymore now that she's in high school, but my son for sure. And so we're reading Agatha Christie book together, and that's really fun for us. I'll say with your younger kids, doing shared reading, even with elementary school age kids, and asking higher level questions during that to get their brains working and hear what their thinking is and what their responses is, that's so much fun. So modeling that love of learning. And as parents and educators, we need to ask ourselves if we are consistently showing our children that we love learning. So this is just an overview of emotional overexcitability. So another one that would lead to kind of that greater development. So often the first overexcitability we notice sometimes might be misdiagnosed. I don't really like that so much as bipolar disorder. I will say with any of these where we mention mental health, don't rule out potential mental health issues. That's not what we're saying to do. We just want to have that in there, that just be aware that some of these characteristics may not lead to mental health, but it could be that. So characteristics, extremes of emotions, concern, compassion, empathy, heightened sense of right and wrong, early capacity for deep relationships. And we often treat this as if the kid is overreacting and they just don't know what to do, with all those emotions, those feelings. I mean, it's a very intense physical response that comes with it. So that's the physical response to the emotions. So an over-identification with how other people are feeling, internalizing it, other people's feelings, emotions, experiences, and you see how this kind of pairs with that intellectual overexcitability. This might lead to intense anxiety, a feeling of a sense of responsibility or inadequacy, inferiority. That isolation, always watch that isolation, because that, you definitely want to get involved when your child starts isolating themselves. The depression, the need for security, to be reassured that everything is okay. So with this, just remember that all emotions and feelings, we accept them. We need to accept them in our children, in our students, even if we don't agree with them. I always say, and I know Amy says the same thing, that their perceptions are valid, and one of the worst things that we can do is discount how our children, how our students are feeling. Help recognize triggers. So typically, if you start to play the role of a little bit of a researcher, you might notice that when this tends to happen, it triggers this emotional reaction. And to just observe and start to notice those patterns becomes extremely important, and having those conversations with the student, with the child, so they can have that language and know what their triggers are, so that they can, de-escalate when they know, okay, I'm being triggered now. They recognize it. That self-awareness piece is so important. Brainstorm coping strategies to deal with intense emotions. I know Amy has talked about, like, exercise could be really fantastic. I know my daughter, practices yoga, does dance, there's deep breathing, mindfulness, journaling, art. So what strategies do we have? And then Amy, do you want to speak to this chart to the right?
Sure. This is just one example of a prop, I guess, to help them kind of gauge where they are emotionally and to be able to communicate it with you. It's a great conversation starter, on a scale of 1 to 10, how stressed are you? How are you feeling today? And then giving them the opportunity to talk about it if they would like to discuss and just share more about it. So just a good jumping off point to share emotions.
Yeah, and don't put it in front of them when they're at a 7 to 10 and be like, show me where you are, right? We don't want to do that. Like Amy's saying, it's more preventative to kind of discuss, okay, and kind of check in, so that we don't get to that 7 or 10. What can we do, okay, so that we don't get there? This is just another, help them describe what they're feeling. A lot of times kids don't have the language to just what they're feeling, and this is just a visual. So anger could mean lots of things. Anger could mean, hurt. If a child says they're feeling hurt, that's a little bit different than feeling angry. If they're saying they're feeling devastated or insecure, that's an even deeper conversation, right? So again, thinking about the language that we can give to children when they don't always have it, especially when they are upset. They may also like to express what they're feeling, in a different way. What they're feeling may be like a color, and that might be like a way for them to then, branch off and tell you more. Ask them open-ended questions to find out more. Help them to reframe what are the facts of the situation and what are your perceptions. So something happened. Now list for me, let's list together the facts, and then let's list kind of what you're thinking about it. And then let's kind of compare those two to see where some of that overthinking and perseveration might be coming in and what the reality of that situation was. When everything seems negative, ask them, what are you grateful for today? What do you think you'll be able to what will you be emotionally ready to tackle tomorrow, right? What's one thing? It could be something small. What do you think you're going to try? And then how can I support you with this? Be aware of your reactions. Listen to hear, not to talk. We need to really try to avoid lecturing kids, but listen to hear what they're really thinking. We never want to respond to intensity with intensity. So if our child is there, we don't want to raise them there. That's going to accomplish nothing, right? So we may have to give ourselves a timeout. Be aware of how you or others may model emotionally intense reactions. So if you kind of have that emotional overexcitability and you're getting really stressed and flustered, like I know I've done many, many times, they're watching, right? In the classroom, they're watching. At home, they're watching. You want to model for them how to appropriately handle that. And if you don't, that's okay. Talk about it after. This is how I should have, handled it, right? So try not to take things from them personally, especially when they're in those moments. Remember, I can't control your actions, but I am in control of my reaction.
Okay, sensual is the next overexcitability we're going to talk about. Overview of this one, basically when we're talking about sensual overexcitability, we are just talking about these heightened awarenesses of the 5 senses. So heightened sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. Students that are individuals at any age that experience this often have this sincere, deep appreciation of beauty that might even bring them to tears when they see something beautiful. Extreme sensitivity to smells, tastes, and textures, that can be good. That can cause problems for sure. Craving for pleasure, again, could be positive. That also could be negative at times. And a desire for comfort in different ways. When we talk about challenges, it's not unusual for there to be some overindulgence in things because they enjoy it so much. They enjoy the taste of food so much. They enjoy being the center of attention. It hits on all of those different senses. They also may have adverse reactions to sense, light, noise, textures. Those are things that you need to be aware of. They're very real to this individual. That tag, in the shirt, I've heard people talk about that before. With our youngest daughter, it was when we would go out to eat, she was so sensitive to light and the smell of the bathrooms in the restaurants. We would have to choose our restaurants based on how bright the light was and the smell in the bathroom, which we could never smell, but she was so super sensitive to that. So those are some things that can potentially cause challenges for individuals that have this central overexcitability. Some strategies that you can use to help with that. If it's possible to structure the environment, especially the home environment, the bedroom environment, the school environment, to avoid stimuli that you've discovered creates a problem for the child, do that. Make it as easy as you can until they can start making some of those decisions and figuring out on their own. And that kind of ties to the last bullet here. Help them figure out what they need to do when they are out of that comforting environment, when they're in unfamiliar contexts. What are things that they can do to help bring some of that comfort, to help self-soothe in a way? And then provide opportunities for them to be the center of attention, because if you don't provide those opportunities, they will find them, they will make them themselves, and not always in the best possible way. So if they know that they're going to have an opportunity to be the center of attention and feel all that love, that's something that they can look forward to. Imaginational is another overexcitability. With this one, there's often a mixture between truth and fantasy, and especially at the early ages, sometimes it's very, very difficult for them to tell the difference. What happens in their head is so real that to them, that is the truth. They love their dreams. They love living in their own heads. They are able to process information visually, which can be a strength, but sometimes, especially in the school system, that can be a challenge as well if they're visual processors. But they have these wonderful imaginations. They tend to have good senses of humor. They believe in magic. They really, really, up to a certain age, and often after that, believe in magic. They love poetry, music, drama. And many of them are going to have imaginary friends when they're young. So that's often an indicator that there's some imaginational overexcitability. Challenges with this is they often have a low tolerance for boredom. What is happening in their heads is almost always better than what's happening outside of their heads. So sometimes getting them to engage, getting them to pull back from daydreaming out the window and do what it is you're asking them to do can be a challenge. I said earlier, blurred line between truth and fiction, and because their imagination, what they dream up, what they see, what they believe is so real, sometimes there's this unnatural almost fear of the unknown, because anything could happen in their worlds. In their imagination, anything could be true, and sometimes that can be a scary place to be. Strategies for imaginational, give them opportunities to engage in literature and storytelling and movies that deal with fantasy, fairy tales, science fiction. Give them opportunities to talk about what they're imagining and what they're dreaming. And make sure you celebrate that imagination. It can be really challenging, but you need to celebrate it, and at the same time, gently help them learn to differentiate it when it's appropriate. I tell a story about my oldest daughter that neither of my daughters know that we share these stories, but her imagination was the truth to her. She would just tell us things every day that there's no possible way they could ever happen, ever have happened, ever happen in the future. And so we had to be really, really thoughtful in the way we dealt with it. And so we would start by saying, that is so cool, or that is so amazing, or wow, I can't believe that. And then prompt, is that something that really happened or something that you hope will happen? Wow, that's great. Is that something that really happened or something you're wishing would happen? Just to validate, but help her start thinking about, there is at times a line that needs to be recognized between fantasy and what's really happening. Role playing, building on creativity in order to do everyday tasks or things that you can incorporate to help keep them engaged, to help avoid boredom. Psychomotor overview. This is that need for constant stimulation. And we often think about psychomotor as physical activity, but it's also mental activity that just continues to be necessary for them to feel like they are happy and content. Sometimes, and like Jenny said, we have to be careful. We have to be careful of making the diagnosis. We can't make the diagnoses, but there are characteristics of ADHD that overlap with psychomotor overexcitability. So it's just good to know, get all of the information before any diagnosis is made. Characteristics of these individuals are often very driven to succeed at whatever they do. It's rapid speech. I hear myself talking really fast as I say that. Often rapid speech. When they are talking to other people, they tend to be very competitive. They need intense physical activity of some sort to really feel good. They can be very overwhelming to other people who don't understand this overexcitability. They're constantly in motion. They're messing with people around them. They often need to process everything verbally. Everything has to be said out loud to someone, and sometimes over and over again. They tend to overcommit, often impulsive behavior. They tend to not need as much sleep. My youngest daughter stopped napping at 18 months and never took a nap again in her life, didn't sleep much at night. So this is often a characteristic that can be very, very challenging for families. Some strategies for psychomotor, make sure that they have that opportunity for physical and verbal activity every day, even though it's very likely going to wear you out. They very much need it. Again, just like with everything, we need to validate, we need to recognize the whole child, give them opportunities to be themselves whenever we can. Brainstorm activities that can meet their needs and also be acceptable to people around them. That's very important. We want them to be appreciated for who they are, and not people to feel like they are bothering those around them. So working to find ways to meet their needs in an acceptable way is really important. And then time for unstructured, spontaneous activity is very important for these individuals, for these kids. Just me. Okay.
And this is our last slide, so just remember, connections and relationships are key. Amy and I, in our research, we talk about the importance of connections to learning, to peers, to the future, to your environment. Those connections are so important. Nurturing awareness, helping them to be aware of who they are, and to validate, those differences, and to give them strategies when they need it, to address those differences when they start to become problematic. Focusing on positive aspects of overexcitability and developmental growth, instead of pathologizing, this is going to be negative and it's going to turn into something bad. How can we grow it and make it something positive? And then accepting them, like Amy said, for who they are, the whole child. So that is it. We do want to share with you that we are doing a research study So we're beginning a study on how families of gifted children experience and cope with stress. So if you're interested in participating in this, it will consist of a brief survey that you'll receive electronically and just one interview with either me or Amy via Zoom or over the phone, probably approximately 45 to 60 minutes. In order to participate, we are looking for parents or guardians of a gifted child who is under or over 18 years old, a gifted adult who's over 18 years old and can recall their K-12 home and schooling experiences, or a gifted student who's in grades 6 to 12 and parental consent will be required. So if you're interested in, or you know people that might be interested in helping us understand how families of gifted children experience and cope with stress, especially now given circumstances, we would love to talk to you. So that is my email address at the bottom, which you are going to see again momentarily. I'm going to let Amy talk you through this final slide.
This is just very brief. We just wanted to make sure to share some of what we offer at UNC that Jenny and I are involved in. We have our graduate programs. We're glad to provide information to anyone who's interested in any graduate programming in gifted education. We have our summer enrichment program, which is preschool through high school through 12th grade enrichment program in the summer on campus at University of Northern Colorado. We did have an online option last year that we're exploring again for this year. And then we have a book that came out not very long ago. It came out in 2019, has a 2020 copyright, but on Start Seeing and Serving Underserved Gifted Students. So we have lots of strategies in there and are glad to talk more about that if anybody's interested.
Thank you so much, ladies. Thank you for sharing tonight. I think one of my favorite things that you shared over and over again, it's about who they are versus what they do. I think in education, we can get so focused on the product or what's being produced, and we have expectations as educators, and we have tests that we need students to perform on. But I just like the freedom of, it's about who they are, how their brains are wired, and not what they do. So I really appreciated that. We did get a couple of questions. So the first one we got says, these kids can do hard math, and this could probably be any content area. They can do the more difficult, but not the easier. So how do you identify these kids correctly? What do we do in an instance like this? Or the other part of this question also has to do with maybe gifted students who are slow processors. How do we approach these students who maybe the output doesn't look typical to get what we need from them?
Absolutely. We need to be looking at multiple indicators of gifted potential. I think Amy and I will say that over and over and over again. A single test score is never enough to help us, understand where giftedness is in a child. We should be looking at, how they think, what they produce in school, their behaviors, talking to their families, talking to, previous teachers, and kind of putting together, multiple criteria in order to see, potential. And sometimes it's giving them that opportunity to perform. So when you see them able to do something that seems pretty remarkable, digging deeper into that in order for that gifted potential to arise. Amy, did you want to add to that?
I agree with everything you said. I'm not sure that I understood the first question, so I wondered if we need to circle
Sure, but I'm happy. So she wrote, these kids can do hard math and not easy ones, so the system doesn't identify them correctly. What do we do in an instance like that? I think where they struggle or won't produce the basic, but they can do the more advanced. and how do we handle a situation like that?
So one thing that we talk about is that everything needs to be individualized to a degree. So it would really be about finding out what was happening with that child. Are they not producing at, are they bored and so they're just not interested in doing the low level math? Is it, I know like on assessments often, if you could sit down and ask a child how they got to that final answer, it would make complete sense. They've made all of these connections and they're answering something or solving something over here that makes complete sense in their head, but you wouldn't know it unless you talk to them. And I also know with math in particular, often those students that are very advanced, high potential, gifted in math, they don't always understand why they know the answers. It just makes sense. It's just almost intuitive to them. And to ask them to slow down and try and explain it or answer it in steps is often excruciating to them, but also sometimes they don't understand how they got there. So I still don't know that we're getting at exactly what she's asking, but I'm going to agree with Jenny in that we just need to get as much possible information as we can on that child. If they're solving those hard math problems, there's something there that we need to address and program for, even if we're not identifying them in any way yet. So it's that collection of a body of evidence about the whole child, everything that we know about him or her in order to better meet those needs.
Yeah, and I would also say have that conversation with whoever the gifted facilitator, coordinator is. You know, when we look at Colorado, there's pretty specific guidelines about how a child can qualify, you know, for gifted services. And perhaps within this school or district, they're only looking at, you know, a particular measure of achievement and like a CAGT test, and those aren't going to give that child the opportunity to necessarily, you know, demonstrate what they know. So, you know, there might be another test of, you know, cognitive ability that would be better suited for that child, or, you know, another test of achievement. So kind of being informed and being able to ask those questions. But I never think formal identification should preclude a child from receiving services. So also advocating, you know, if the child can do this upper level math, you know, let's keep, you know, investigating that further and trying to cultivate that, I think is really important.
I think that's great advice. Thank you. Our next question, I think you touched on throughout the presentation, but I want to honor the question in case you want to dive into it a little more. Anna asked, is there an overlap between overexcitabilities and something like sensory processing disorder? I know you talked about possibility of ADHD and a lot of other what we would consider disabilities and that overlap, but maybe you could speak more to that.
Okay, yes, I maybe not, I don't know that, even though we're in gifted education, we have a hard time with labels, with labeling people, honestly. So but when you look at characteristics of some of these overexcitabilities and sensory processing, there is definitely an overlap. It may be a combination of both. It may be that, you know, that central overexcitability is so strong that it's being perceived as sensory processing disorder. But there's definitely some overlap between the two, and strategies that you would use for sensory processing also can potentially help these kids as well.
Jenny, did you want to add anything? Or
No, I mean, I would just say, you know, we definitely are not about, you know, labeling, and we're certainly not going to diagnose. So, I mean, if you do have, you know, concerns about that, just to make sure that you're talking, you know, to the appropriate people that can take that information and kind of help you. But having this extra information about, hey, there's, you know, overexcitability, there's some other things that exist, will help you in those conversations, you know, to figure out how to best help your child. It's never a bad thing to have as much information as you possibly can.
Thank you. A couple more questions. One, maybe this is an easy question to answer. They wanted to know if your slides would be available after this. So I didn't know if you're able to allow people to have access to these slides, or if they'll only be able to see it through our recorded video.
Yeah, I mean, we're happy to share these slides. I don't know if you want to, Elizabeth, just let us know the best way to
Sure.
share these slides.
If you're able to share them, if you send us the link, we're happy to post it with your video on our website. Or if you would rather have people reach out to you individually, email you that they'd like a copy of it, whatever is best for you. So answer is yes.
We'll share it with you. Sorry, we'll share it with you. And if you want to post it, that'd be great.
Okay. One question about your research study. Someone was asking, is there a stipend for participating, or is it just strictly volunteers?
At this point, it is strictly volunteers. We had talked about that, but that introduces some different issues with the institutional review board process, and so it would be volunteer.
Okay, great. Last question. What was that, Amy? Sorry.
No, I asked Jenny if she wanted to flip back over to that research slides. We were talking about it.
Oh, sure.
One final question, because I know we're out of time, and we appreciate you so much for sharing with us. This question from Jessica, she wants to know, do you have any suggestions for gifted students who struggle with change? Everything from the small stuff like haircuts to big stuff like moving to a new state, and now all of the changes because of COVID-19, obviously big deal. So any suggestions or helpful thoughts around that?
You know, I think that's so child specific, and that's knowing your child. I mean, I will say I feel it strongly as a mother. And I try to create little rituals and routines, you know, within my own home. And so I have it down kind of to a T, you know, what I do, what my kids can expect from the time they wake up, you know, until the time they go to bed. And I'm not saying that that's right for every family, but I'm saying that that sure is, it has really helped my two children, one who really struggles with change.
Yeah, I agree. And I think anything you can do to help ground them in what is familiar is helpful. I also, depending on how big the change, there are lots of our students that deal with just changing from one activity to another when it's not his or her idea, because they become so engaged in, you know, whatever it is that they're doing. It's so much more interesting, and it can cause tantrums if all of a sudden they're asked to change and do something different. So I think within reason, when you can prepare them and actually give them, you know, a time frame and help remind them, help them kind of work up to that transition point, that can be helpful as well.
Yeah, and I will add to that. I mean, I also will go over what are different possible outcomes or scenarios with my kids, you know, because sometimes they will, you know, they have everything kind of planned out in their heads, and they'll have expectations of something, and that's not what ends up being, and then that is devastating to them. And so I think it's important to have the discussion, and it's not like the outcome that you want is not going to be the outcome that you're going to get, but you know, what are some other things that you might have to deal with. So if you have to, you know, end up going, you know, fully online, and you don't see your friends, for example, I'm not sure what your particular situation is, you know, what can we do about that? How can you stay in contact with them? You know, just kind of preparing them kind of ahead of time. Not that this is going to happen, but if this were to happen, here's some ways we can deal with it, so it's not such a shock.
Yeah, giving them agency in any situation like that is helpful.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, ladies. I think this was great for parents to understand their gifted children better and have some strategies to walk away with directly. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. I hope that you learned a lot tonight as well. Don't forget to register for our virtual conference that's coming up in October. You don't have to live in Colorado because it's virtual. So those of you in Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, please register, join us. You get to hear from more people like you do every Tuesday live at 5 with us. Next Tuesday, we have Jennifer Gottschalk joining us, and it's all about nurturing your writers. So whether they're passionate and talented writers and you want to encourage them in that, or if you have a reluctant writer and you're wondering how to get more out of them, you'll want to join us next week. So thank you, ladies, so much. Everyone enjoy the rest of your Tuesday evening.